Hello and welcome to the Hayes Parsons webinar series. This week's webinar topic is returning to school and the insurance implications of doing so. I am Mark Rose, an account executive at Hayes Parsons, specialising in advice to schools and colleges. My colleague Ben Lear will be running the content of this week's webinar. Ben is the Head of Education at Hayes Parsons. It's fair to say that over the last few weeks we have received many calls from bursars around the country concerned about whether their insurance will cover them when they opened earlier this week. We hope that today's discussions will help guide you further as we continue to move forward and you adjust to bringing in more children. I'll now hand over to Ben for the main content.
Mark, thank you. This morning, we intend to provide succinct commentary regarding the reopening of schools and considerations for the coming months, and what expectations you should have from your liability insurances. Our comments are generic in nature, and although the construct of liability insurances are quite uniform, we would nonetheless recommend you discuss your school's own position with your current insurance provider. We will discuss the general premise of liability insurance and link this to the reopening of schools and colleges, but also comment upon activities schools would ordinarily expect to do, but where there may not be much prescriptive detail. Apparent do's and don'ts appear to be changing quite quickly, which can cause confusion. From an insurance perspective, and in our opinion, there is actually clarity, which we will share with you now. We do recognise, though, that this is quite a dry topic, therefore have tried to keep it simple and relevant to the current situation schools find themselves in, and indeed to share discussions that we are having with our own school clients. Towards the end, there will be a question and answer session, and I am pleased to say that we do have a few already in. But should you wish to provide any or submit any of your own during this presentation, please do so via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Turning to legal liability. Liability insurance policies are predicated on the tort of negligence. For a claim to be considered, the claimant, whether it be a member of staff or a pupil or indeed another third party, need to have evidence that they have been wronged by the school. And the most common statute is still through the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. For coronavirus, schools need to think about their duty of care obligations towards employees, as well as towards the pupils themselves and the families and other persons. Reliable scientific conclusions are still evolving, but it appears to be accepted that children are less likely to contract COVID-19 themselves, but their propensity to transmit is still open to debate. For employers' liability, it is recommended schools ensure the welfare of staff are considered with their interaction with pupils, which could relate to the provision of personal protective equipment, taking into account the personal circumstances of the individual, but noting that face masks are not recommended in schools. Enhanced hygiene and cleaning measures, and perhaps perceived vulnerabilities. The issue of pupil and staff bubbles, a term we are now more familiar with, needs to be considered also, especially when staff may be split between different bubbles due to teaching specialisms. Risk assessments would of course ensure all decision-making rationale and staff training are documented, which assists with potential claims defensibility. For public liability, risk assessments remain key, although in addition to the previous comments relating to staff, greater emphasis may be placed upon the specific needs of the child and how they interact with each other. Considerations could be down to the day-to-day aspects such as catering, use of cutlery, water bottles, down to the fine nitty-gritty of even the sharing of pencils. Ensuring social distance is maintained and the children are aware of what they need to do, and expected behaviour should be explained and communicated with parents. So what do you need to inform your insurers of? We are aware of some guidance to schools have stated that the decision-making rationale and indeed risk assessments should be submitted to your insurer for their comments and indeed perhaps sign off. We are unsure where this came from, perhaps the legal profession. The reality is Insurers do not have the capacity to read through all these documents and advise within the timescales. In addition, there are ordinarily no exclusions regarding diseases within liability policies. Therefore, so long as the school has taken reasonable precautions, then cover should apply. The strength of the risk assessment, in part, will determine how liable the school may be for any outbreak. But of course, there is no COVID-19 legal precedence yet in this area. We are also of the opinion that government guidance is just that. It cannot inform about all permutations and is not binding. It is down to the school to best interpret such guidance for their own situation and apply accordingly. Your liability insurance will not be prejudiced for the school's own interpretations where made in good faith. We also recommend perspective be applied to the current environment. COVID-19 is invisible, and schools should of course shine the COVID light on all aspects of school life, but it could be argued the risks to a school from a likelihood perspective remain higher elsewhere. As an example, catering may be scaled back with a limited offering, which could mean increased packed lunches from home if such is allowed. Take an example. If a peanut butter sandwich slipped through and someone with a nut allergy came into contact with it, the school would probably be held legally liable for any injury sustained by the person with the allergy. Although a minor illustration, we recommend core risk assessments are not inadvertently overlooked. It is also worth noting that over the last couple of months, schools have had to find their own way to adapt when looking after key worker children, which are a variety of age and need without the guidance there is now. Insurers would not have known the ins and outs about what schools were doing, but liability cover has been in force. Turning to specific queries we have come across, we thought it would be helpful to tackle a few. The first one being play equipment. Taking the right precautions, there is no reason this equipment cannot be enjoyed. Current guidance refers to appropriate cleaning regimes when different groups of children use it, and also to ensure multiple groups do not use at the same time. Advice here would relate to increased cleaning, closer supervision by staff, and it being used by each bubble on a daily basis only. There should be close communication between staff as to who used and when, with suitable records kept to sit alongside the cleaning sheets. Sports day. So long as there is non-contact and children do not mingle outside of their bubbles and social distance can be maintained, then this should be a consideration. In light of how coronavirus can stay on surfaces, consideration should be given to what the sports may entail. Spaced out running would be fine, but where equipment may be used, this may not be appropriate. Your risk assessments would guide you as to what feels reasonable. Then there is the question of parental attendance. It sounds counterintuitive for this particular day, but we would recommend they do not attend. It will only increase the work on behalf of the school, and in light of limited persons being allowed on site at any one time, you could be going into a grey area. Swimming. Towards the end of June, swimming is back on the menu. Similar commentary applies in respect of hygiene regimes and social distancing. And for a 25-metre pool with 5 lanes, for example, it would be worthwhile the children getting back in the pool. Children would though need to be what is now defined as beach ready, therefore changing facilities should not be used, which in itself perhaps increases safeguarding and privacy concerns of the children. Boarding. With social distancing currently at 2 metres and the continuation of operating in bubbles, boarding is impacted in terms of capacity. It is though likely 2 metres will become less soon, which should increase the capacity which may be possible. Apart from the obvious redesigning of dormitories and managing common areas, toilet and showering facilities and catering and other such day-to-day, consideration should be given to the potential impacts of the proposed quarantine rules for visitors entering the UK. We know some schools are looking into opening boarding facilities 2 or 3 weeks earlier than usual for the new academic year, so education downtime is not lost through potential self-isolation, which for a child in itself would be challenging. If you did wish for additional assistance from your insurer on these or indeed any other potential activity, they should be able to provide such on a case-by-case basis. But as mentioned at the outset, we do not believe you need to run anything by them for prior authorization. Parents choose to send their children to your school for a number of reasons. Wherever possible, the ethos and culture of the school should be maintained. It's about striking the balance. Turning to the summer months. What should schools expect over this period, and in particular focusing on third-party lettings, premises and the actual buildings themselves? It is doubtful schools will wish to hand over parts of the premises to third parties who would ordinarily run language or sports schools or clubs over the summer, which could utilise the boarding, grounds and catering facilities. Although this means a further loss of income, we think the risks involved are probably too great. And indeed, the school may want the premises to themselves as you consider what measures you need to implement for September. And indeed, perhaps a little bit further, based on a BBC news article which released yesterday, which said full expectations of all pupils going back for all year groups, maybe further into the autumn. Although we know that independent schools have smaller class sizes, so this might be a little easier to accommodate. Turning to facilities lettings, which include outbuildings and changing and toilets. We know schools hand over sports facilities to third-party clubs, and this can include the use of changing and toilet facilities. It should be a consideration for these activities to continue. Although for swimming clubs, they would need to pay close attention to the evolving guidance and update their risk assessments accordingly. Just ensure that third-party risk assessments are looked over by the school and you are comfortable with changes they have made. Outdoor space, primarily sports pitches and the like. You may usually hand over sports pitches to cricket clubs or footballing, coaching and such like, which could be daily. We see no reason why these cannot continue, but the same comment does apply with regards to looking over the third-party risk assessments. As a reminder, on hayesparsons.co.uk/coronavirus, we have a dedicated hub which is constantly being updated. Please do take a look to see whether this may provide a snippet of detail which could help your school. Mark, I know we've had some questions in advance and perhaps some more during this presentation, so back to you.
Thank you, Ben. A number of the questions you've already included within the actual webinar itself, but we have had a few extras to deal with. Now, in year 6, the head would like each of the 2 bubbles to operate with 1 teacher in 1 room for 2 days, while the other bubble works with 1 teacher and a TA. Then, on the other 2 days, the teachers will stay in the same rooms and the children will swap rooms and staff. Is this okay?
Thank you, Mark. The government accepts that in secondary schools, there are specialist teachers who need to teach different groups. In the independent school sector, such specialisms are introduced at a much earlier age. So you have to look at the situation in context. If allowed for in a secondary schools, then subject to minimising the risks through risk assessments, control measures, such as deep cleaning between the groups, we do not consider this would breach the government guidelines. But as always, please keep a document of the decision-making process and indeed the reasons for how you conclude why you got to this conclusion that you did.
Thank you, Ben. Next then is year 10 has 18 pupils, so 25% is 4.25. Does this mean only 4 at a time, or may we round up to 5 or even higher if the risk assessment shows that we can maintain social distancing with that number?
Okay, although the guidance is 25%, it is ultimately down to the school to decide what the answer should be in respect of whether additional pupils above the 25% should be considered. And again, this is through the risk assessments. But I do think it's worth noting where this 25% actually came from. It came from government guidance, which is generic. And in our opinion, it probably has the state sector in mind because that is where the majority of pupils are taught and their class sizes are inherently higher. So if you could go above 25%, for the smaller class sizes and make it work within the premises that your school actually has, then I do believe that this would prejudice your insurance cover.
Great, thank you. You mentioned use of climbing frames. What about musical instruments being used by children?
Okay, I would take this into two directions. One where the musical instruments are owned by the pupils themselves, and the other direction being those that are owned or provided by the school. In respect to pupils who bring their own instruments to school, it should be ensured that only they use them, that they are cleaned after use, that they are put away in their cases, especially in respect of where you may need to use your mouth to play the instrument. In respect of the school provision, the instruments should not be shared between the bubbles. If you are changing from one bubble to another, there should be a clean handover and a deep clean undertaken before the next bubble uses the equipment. It would be recommended though, and this is a recommendation only because again, there is no prescriptive detail on this that we can find at least, that guitars, drums and keyboards and such like should be used. But clarinets or trumpets or anything that involves the use of the mouth should probably be avoided at this time.
Thanks again. Can you provide any comments on shielded and vulnerable adults returning to work?
The school should firstly understand why the member of staff is considered to be shielded or vulnerable, and a discussion should take place with them before they actually returned to work. And this is to make sure that they are indeed comfortable to begin with. Following that conversation, it may well be that consideration should be given to, would they be coming back to the same role? Are any changes needed? The roles performed? Are any timings needed to when they may be present at school? Indeed, should there be any specific need for any personal protective equipment which could be linked to the vulnerability of that particular adult? All would be documented in a personalised risk assessment, but I would probably say the format would be similar to a return to work style approach for when members of staff could have been off ill, just to make sure that you've covered off all the potential adaptations that might be required.
Thank you. Now, interesting one. Can we run school open days?
Currently, probably not, simply because you, in the main, wish to limit persons attending on site. But I think it's fair to say government guidance in respect of how we can live our lives is changing quite rapidly. So if the schools wish to consider running one in the summer months, I think as long as it can be done safely and social distancing measures can be complied with, number one, I see no reason to not do so. And number two, there would be no insurance implications. At the end of the day, schools, independent schools, have great facilities to show off to prospective parents. And they could be a little bit nervy in respect of what enrolment might look like in September. So I would not let insurance connotations get in the way if it can be done safely.
Thanks again. Now, if we have a positive case of COVID-19, will we have to close or will insurance be impacted by this?
Okay, we do know there have been a couple of examples just in the press regarding schools that have opened and then shut again as a result of outbreaks. Although there is no explicit guidance on this, but the insurance cover would follow the guidance the school would receive from the local health authority. If you don't follow these, the school could be deemed to be acting recklessly if they continued, although this, of course, is probably unlikely. In terms of closure itself, this is speculative, and I would expect if there was one positive case and it can be traced to the bubble they are in only, and that bubble will probably have to go into isolation. But probably, and I say probably because we don't know yet, the school could continue if other bubbles are not impacted. If it jumps the infection from one bubble to another, then I think it more likely that the local health authority might close down the school and undertake additional tracing and contacting. But again, we're into a little bit of the unknown at the moment.
Right. What is your advice regarding managing contractors and suppliers?
The school will need to continue engaging with these to ensure that the school fabric is maintained. The contractors would have their own insurance. And as was mentioned at the outset, liability policies do not restrict cover as a result of diseases. However, the school is the employer to these parties, and we need to ensure that they are happy with the updated risk assessments provided by the contractor or the supplier. So long as all is documented, a form of business as usual can continue.
We are a prep school ending at year 8. Could we get year 8 back for a socially distanced prize giving or outdoor concert?
Tricky one. There is nothing prescriptive to say you can or can't do this. If we think logically about it, the insurance would not be invalidated so long as you take reasonable precautions and have suitable risk assessments. I think there's the potential to do this if it was outside. I would not do it inside, but the communications with the schools, between the school and the parents would need to be very tight, and there would need to be probably a form of parental consent for their child to attend. I would recommend numbers be restricted, but in principle, I don't think that there is necessarily an issue with it.
Right, and one last question we have. Can we run a head teacher recruitment process in school to include some interaction with a small group of pupils, albeit at a distance?
Sorry, could you run that one by me again?
Can we run a head teacher recruitment process in school to include some interaction with a small group of pupils? So they want to recruit a new head.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand the premise of the question. It's a tricky one because at the moment, the guidance is not, wherever possible, to mix bubbles, so to speak. And that includes teachers, although that has been caveated with a previous question in respect of specialisms where teachers may flip from one to the other. Again, it comes down to risk assessments and reasonable precautions. The school has to function, the school has to continue. If there is a recruitment process that needs to be had, it makes sense for prospective heads to observe current practices and to get under the skin a little bit more in respect of how the school operates. And I mentioned the school's ethos and culture earlier, and I think it's linked to this. Again, there is nothing stopping that happening. I would take care in respect of how it is done and limited exposure. But from an insurance perspective, there is nothing in the construct of most insurance policies that we have seen, and that covers quite a few in the education spectrum, which say there is anything in there that would prohibit such a course of action.
Thank you, Ben. That was the last of the questions. If anyone else has any additional questions that they want to raise with us, do please get in touch when we'll be pleased to help. A reminder that next week's webinar is cyber threats facing schools, so I hope that we will see you all again then. So thanks for attending and goodbye.
Thank you.